Good evening and welcome to the final lecture of the 2021 Southern Studies Conference virtual program organized by Auburn University at Montgomery. My name is Naomi Slip and I am the conference director and an associate professor of art history at AUM. First, I would like to thank the members of the Southern Studies Conference Organizing Committee for pivoting so gracefully to a virtual conference this year. I'd also like to thank Andrew McMichael, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, and Kim Brackett, Associate Dean, for supporting the conference, as well as Catherine Ashmore in the Dean's Office for managing the logistics. The conference events conclude tonight. Since April 22nd, we have had the privilege of listening to 2 student research panels, a student-focused roundtable, and 3 public lectures by renowned scholars in the field, including tonight's talk. We hope that you have been with us for some of these events and that you've enjoyed them. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Erin McIntosh. Professor McIntosh is a cross-disciplinary artist and 4th-generation quilt maker whose work mines the intersections of material culture, family tradition, sexual desire, and identity politics in a range of works including quilts, sculpture, collage, drawing, and writing. McIntosh holds a BFA from the Appalachian Center for Craft, Tennessee Technological University, and an MFA from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. He has held residencies at the Banff Center in Alberta, Canada, Haystack Mountain School of Craft on Deer Isle, Maine, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts in Amherst, Virginia. He is the recipient of a Center for Craft Wingate Fellowship in 2006 and 2015. A 2018 Virginia Museum of Fine Arts Fellowship, and most recently, the 2020 United States Artist Fellowship in Craft. Congratulations, very exciting. His work has been exhibited at the Toledo Museum of Art, the Yale University Green Art Gallery, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the International Quilt Study Center, the Los Angeles Craft and Folk Art Museum, and the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York City. His critical writings have been published in the Brooklyn Rail, Hyperallergic, the Surface Design Journal, and the Journal of Modern Craft. Professor McIntosh has held faculty appointments at James Madison University, MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art, and Virginia Commonwealth University. He is currently an associate professor in the Fibres and Material Practices program at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, in Canada. Since 2015, McIntosh manages Invasive Queer Kudzu, a community storytelling and archive project across the LGBTQ South. We are very pleased to welcome Professor McIntosh and learn about his work this evening in a talk titled From Poor Soil, Invasive Queer Kudzu. One brief note on format before we begin. My colleagues, Ben Severance and Eunyoung Kim, and I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A areas. If you have a question for Professor McIntosh, please feel free to type them there. We'll moderate the discussion at the end of the talk. If you want to be named, i.e. we have a question from Dr. Smith at University of Alabama, please feel free to provide your name with the question too. So with that, I will ask Professor McIntosh to take it away.
Okay, hi, welcome everyone. It is, I must admit, as an art prof, it is always so bizarre to hear me, myself referred to as Professor McIntosh. I mostly just go on a first name basis, Erin. If you address me in the questions, feel free to just call me that. So thank you so much for inviting me to share my work and ideas with the community of the Southern Studies Conference. I wasn't familiar with this annual event until the invitation. So it's been interesting to check out the other events that have been happening. And yeah, I applaud the efforts and appreciate the invitation. I was introduced, and I also just want to acknowledge and give my own thank yous to Naomi Slip for the invitation. And a reason for our coming to know of one another would be also through Sarah Beetham, who wrote about the Invasive Queer Kudzu project in a larger piece in your annual journal publication last year. So anyways, it's been lovely to be introduced to the work of the Southern Studies Conference. I'm going to start with just the briefest, a tiny self-introduction to my art practice as a bit of a landing pad, I suppose, for the Invasive Queer Kudzu project. and then walk us through several of these interrelated projects over the past 8 or 9 years. I'd like you to think about when I'm talking and getting into the weeds about kudzu, about our peculiar relations that we have formed with plants, between plants and people. So I'm going to get started here. Let's see. Quilts, weeds, a shabby colonial revival couch. My works reach across generational divides through a language of form and material dialect. Stories of cruising men and family pastimes collide to draw attention to the murky intersections of personal desires and family institutions. My work is rooted in the material, process, and cultural attributes of quilt making. As a fourth generation quilter, this handwork tradition is literally in my bones. It's in my muscle memory. While an overview of my bodies of work might suggest a multimedia or more sculptural approach, quilt-like accumulation and piecework are primary across my practice. Whether personal or communal, minimal or maximal, quilts are flexible, open objects, full of possibility. I see piecework, working with scraps, as a global paradigm, as a cognitive framework for understanding the complex ways that identities are forged by their scraps of connection to other people, media, and communities. Over the past few years, although it's been growing to be more than a few, as I look at that date there of 2013, my practice has seen a shift towards an interrogation of the queer body's articulations and vulnerabilities in nature spaces or rural settings. When I say nature, obviously it's a specious term and can mean many different things to many different folks. In 2013, a two-person exhibition, which happened in Virginia Commonwealth University, Untended was its title, got me thinking more deeply about my innate connections to the land, to the Appalachian homeland of myself and my ancestors, to gardening and my family's ties to the mountains. Spending a summer with my mother's family as my grandmother passed away had me out in the garden with my family, picking weeds and tending a final crop with my mother and her sisters. This experience became the impetus for new ideas of embedding queerness into representations of nature. I found a strong desire to situate myself between such large concepts as nature and culture. In this body of work titled Weeds, my interpretations of these disregarded local plants are made queer by my patchwork skins of vintage fabrics and printed gay erotica. I draw a covert line of connection between these unwanted plants of our family garden and my own anxious efflorescence as a queer person in a culture steeped in heteronormative tradition. In 2014, I decided to take on the ultimate southern weed, kudzu. Both environmental nuisance and fixture of the landscape, the tenacious kudzu vine figures prominently in our Gothic mythologizing of the South, something I probably don't need to wax poetic about to an audience focused in Southern studies. An invasive species imported from Japan at mid-century by the US Department of Agriculture to control soil erosion, kudzu now engulfs entire landscapes from Virginia to Texas. Initially, I was making kudzu for myself, much in relationship to the weeds work I just showed, indexing my own queer desires through gay literary and erotic materials, such as those used in prior works. But first, I needed to learn more about this fabled plant monster of the Southern imagination. So let's start with this plant's journey. It has quite an interesting one. Kudzu first came to North America in a rather rarefied form. It was a garden feature of the highly ornamental Japanese pavilion of the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this particular Centennial Exposition would become one of the world's most influential fairs, and had a very outsized influence on American arts and crafts. Actually, many art movements would be influenced by visitors to this centennial. The Japanese pavilion, in particular, introduced American audiences to ancient Japanese concepts of asymmetry and the philosophy of wabi-sabi. Ornamental elements from this pavilion very quickly were appropriated by American craftspeople, from the academic arts and crafts movement all the way to home quilters. Some of you might notice that this is a quilting style called crazy quilting. It has very particular traced origins to the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia. And in particular, you might, from the prior slide, have noticed the proliferation of fans. So fans would make their work into the earliest crazy quilts, and even the embroidery techniques that you see that sort of map and trace the shapes in many crazy quilts are considered fancy work is one term for them, but they also borrow on a lot of concepts and motifs of asymmetry. This is a nice, interesting quilt connection when I was initially researching kudzu. So kudzu would find itself traveling back to the United States for a more utilitarian purpose 50 years later. In the earliest great age of industrial agricultural experimentation, kudzu, along with its close cousin, the soybean, were planted in droves across the United States as a possible livestock feed and hay substitute. From the late 1920s to the 1950s, the US Department of Agriculture paid farmers to plant thousands of acres of kudzu, only to eventually accept that it was a very difficult plant to harvest. What the USDA did learn is that kudzu seemed to grow well in nearly any soil, even the very poor red clay, more clay-based soils of the deeper South. This would lead to the craze of planting kudzu along railroad and roadbeds as erosion control, which ramped up significantly during the fledgling interstate highway infrastructure project of the Eisenhower era. From the 1940s to the 1960s, the Soil Erosion Service planted around 70 million kudzu seedlings along highways. And today, most people experience kudzu as they drive by it. Most people's experience of kudzu is actually from a car window, which is important to note given the general distaste of the poor plant. I'd like to share this image there in the very bottom right-hand side is again where one might see it and where it was intentionally planted along railroad beds. But some of these other images, I included this one from Lineville, Alabama. It's the talk I'm giving is here in Alabama, but it was also during this heyday, the USDA through like the 4-H service initiated many rural regions crowning of kudzu kings and queens, and it was like a small publicity kind of stunt. And other people, such as this person, Channing Cope, who's a famous radio broadcaster of the time, founded a Kudzu Club of America. And so these were sort of involved in this civic engagement with this new wonder crop. And it is interesting to note that, again, its very close cousin, genetically, the soybean, is now accounts for such a gigantic amount of our agricultural production in the United States. So what usefulness kudzu seemed to hold? Unfortunately, its success soon got in its own way. In its non-native environment and outside of agricultural cultivation, kudzu flourished as a perennial, rapidly naturalizing in its new southern home. Soon enough, kudzu became problematic. Added to the USDA's noxious weed watch list in 1974, and then becoming quite the poster child of the 1998 National Invasive Species Act. This would cement the plant's status as a much scorned weed in the southern US, where yearly efforts to exterminate it cost southern states millions of dollars. Kudzu taps into regional fears of otherness, connecting it in many, many ways to xenophobia. And I just have just a small little selection here of like things I've collected over the years of this project that sort of point to, when you are from the South and you're familiar with kudzu, as I'm sure many of you are, people love to sort of imagine these fantastic figures or sort of boogeymen in the kudzu and the bottom image there. But also, I don't play video games, but I was interested to learn that there are kudzu creatures that are these bad guys in video games. It just really sort of it points to this, again, general distaste in many times. This is the family I grew up in, like an outright scorn for it. It's that vine from Asia, it's the vine that ate the South. It's so many general pejoratives towards the vine. And it also connects to perceptions of queerness. And the perception and the persistent fear that a homosexual agenda, right, much like kudzu, could sweep across the nation if left unchecked. Today, polls show us that many parts of the US are naturally accepting of gay marriage equality and expanded rights for LGBTQ people. And even though marriage equality is the law of the land since 2015, the southern home of kudzu has become, sadly, from my perspective, a sullied stage in our national political theater, a proving ground of sorts for homophobic and very recently transphobic legislation. Lost in this politicized fray are the lives, memories, stories, and histories of Southern LGBTQ people and their ingenuity in contending and countering the status quo. Queer people and communities in the South are like kudzu. We have thrived in inhospitable soils for many years. Despite efforts to eradicate us, we have persisted. Kudzu's growth is exponential because each vine from a planting can grow over 60 feet in one season, and by some accounts up to 1 foot or 12 inches a day in the height of the summer. And its roots sometimes reach over 12 feet into the ground. It has proved to be a formidable enemy to pesticides. Imagine if we could grow queer visibility and community enforcement across the South with the vigor of kudzu. My initial ideas for this project were led by a desire to destigmatize this plant, rooting out blatant xenophobic and homophobic relationships to it, and understanding from a more holistic perspective the plant's ancient origins and probable futures. After all, kudzu's ethnobotanical origins are rooted in the Korean peninsula, including parts of Japan and China, where the plant has been used as a food plant and medicinal for over 2,000 years. Kudzu, or Pueraria lobata, is listed in Xingnang's herbal classic, the Compendium of Materia Medica, and the Chinese Pharmacopoeia, as an herbal medicine for the treatment of fever, acute dysentery, diarrhea, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases. It's worth noting it's still very much in use today, and this image is rather instructive for how kudzu was not actually attempted to be propagated in the US. At least in Japan and Korea, it's normally trellised, very similar to how we grow grapes. So it is actually controlled in a very particular way, and that is what keeps it from kind of taking over entire environments. And it's also worth noting too that in many cases, kudzu was planted on former, today when you see if it's taken over a large area, it's usually on parts of land that humans have vacated. So in some ways, we have a relationship to it of being a destroyer of all things of the environment, but actually in many ways, it's a non-native but now naturalized plant that is really just sort of inhabiting spaces that humans have already corrupted in the environment. Its most notable use in Chinese medicine is clearing away heat and toxic materials, unclogging meridians, and dispelling the effects of alcohol, protecting the liver and kidney. In popular use, an excellent hangover cure. Modern chemistry has discovered that 70 phytochemicals have been identified in kudzu root, with isoflavonoids and triterpenoids as the major constituents. Animal and cellular studies have provided support for the traditional uses of kudzu root on cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, and endocrine systems, including diabetes and its complications. Kudzu is also very much a traditional foodstuff. Kudzu, or arrowroot, is a thickener, very similar to cornstarch in certain contexts, and also gelatin. Also similar to a seaweed product called agar-agar, which many people are making bioplastic out of these days. It's also used to create a certain kind of noodle, kudzu noodles. And also in Japan, at least, and parts of Korea, very famous for the kudzu mochi desserts. And you can actually see this is if you're in a traditional Chinese medicinal shop, you can buy kudzu as a powder, or in slices. The root rather is what is taken medicinally in tiny slices, but the powder you see on the bottom left there on top of the kudzu mochi is that. In the South, we have a number of different traditions of working food-wise with kudzu, and one of them is kudzu blossom jelly. The little blossoms, which are purple and smell very much like grape soda, are harvested in late fall and turn into a really grape soda-y kind of jelly. Kudzu bast fibers have been used in weaving practices in Japan and Korea for at least as long as it's been used medicinally, but possibly even longer, so up to 4,000 years of use. And also in many knotting traditions across southern China. It's a very strong bast fiber, so it's used in things like rope making, and the kinds of materials it's used for in weaving would have typically been used for things of the home. So woven floor mats, wall coverings, things along those lines. Again, in the South, we have these beautiful tradition of Kudzu baskets. So I have a couple of examples here. One of the most interesting ironies of kudzu in the United States is that it never truly invaded, despite its handle there and poster child of being the Invasive Species Act. Rather, it was brought here and planted with significant intentions. Kudzu's geographical distribution and journey is but one of millions that humans have abetted in the plant world's domination of our globe. Michael Pollan, writing in his seminal text, The Botany of Desire, reorders our presumed subjectivity over plants' agency. Pollan makes the case for coevolutions, 10,000 years old, between plants and humans, framing mutual benefits formed as plants evolved to satiate our desires, and we, in turn, evolved to help them reproduce and disseminate. We like to think of domestication as something we do to other species, but it makes just as much sense to think of it as something certain plants and animals have done to us, a clever evolutionary strategy for advancing their own interest. The species that have spent the last 10,000 years or so figuring out how best to feed, heal, clothe, intoxicate, and otherwise delight us have made themselves some of nature's greatest success stories. So I ask, can we turn around the negative hype on kudzu and see it from a coevolutionary stance? And I've also become really interested in more future forward ways of thinking through invasive species. These are two texts that have informed the project quite significantly. Fred Pierce offers in his New Wild a reimagining of invasive species as probably the harbingers of what will survive and what will thrive with our coming climate-induced die-offs. And so really kind of very future forward and rather grim, but also a really deeper dive into what invasive species are. You know, they rarely have ended up in a place on their own, of their own accord. So really kind of helps me understand how we also can sort of turn around the negative approach to kudzu and look at it as something useful, return to it more as like an art material, return to it as a foodstuff instead of killing it with pesticides, which are not good for any part of the environment. So as I grappled with how to tame this unruly weed metaphor and bring about the sheer mass that is kudzu, I realized how much more powerful and political it would be to decenter my own experience and share the stories of many other Southern LGBTQ folks. And this led to the conceptualization of the Invasive Queer Kudzu Project. This is our logo that we've used. In the beginning, I felt charged to create Southern queer kudzu through a historical lens. I wanted to both understand the histories of queer Southern identities and look for connections to kudzu's own complex legacies. Anne Cvetkovich, in her writing on lesbian cultures and queer archives, explains that in the absence of institutionalized documentation or in opposition to official histories, gay and lesbian archives were formed through grassroots efforts, with collections often begun in the homes of self or group anointed keepers of the flame. Cvetkovich proposes these as an archive of feelings, or the collection of cultural texts and objects that serve as repositories of feelings and emotions, which are encoded not only in the context of the text themselves, but in the practices that surround their production and reception. Cvetkovich further expounds on trauma, which, because it is often unspeakable and unrepresentable and marked by forgetting and dissociation, often seems to leave behind no records at all. Trauma puts pressure on conventional forms of documentation, representation, commemoration, giving rise to new genres of expression, such as testimony, and new forms of monuments, rituals, and performances that can call into being collective witnesses and publics. She's often written about this archive of feeling in connection with, amongst many other queer archive projects, the AIDS Quilt or the Names Project. And as one considers Cvetkovich's call for understanding new monuments of trauma, a particular archive project became further inspiration for the Invasive Queer Kudzu Project, the AIDS Memorial Quilt of the Names Project Foundation. And in her new text, Frey, Art plus Textile Politics, scholar Julia Bryan Wilson expands on the political and psychosocial dimensionality of textiles. She encourages a new verb use of textile, as in to textile politics, or add texture, pliability, and high-low confusion to politics. Bryan Wilson uses the AIDS quilt as a case study in the permeability of textile forms, which can simultaneously hold nationalistic romantic notions of community, signal feminist craft reclamation, and render ambivalent the human devastation of the AIDS disease. Along with the AIDS quilt, I was particularly influenced by another quilt-centric social practice project, Baltimore's Monument Quilt, which has created a national quilt monument for survivors of sexual assault, in which I was an early volunteer project organizer for. So these projects have a kind of sisterhood. These are images of some of the archives that I visited. And all of these ideas gave a firm footing for the project to expand in two directions: towards building an archive as a kind of monument, and also the development of ways to teach and learn Southern queer history through interactive and even touchable archives or touchable stories, something many people have such a disconnection from their Southern queer history because of ongoing political struggles, ongoing religious conservatism, other ways that keep people in the closet and have also kept archives and queer history in the closet in the South. After visiting archives such as the Houston area BOTS and Gulf Coast archives, as well as the one archive in Los Angeles. Again, you have to go far away. You have to go all the way across the country sometimes to do your own Southern queer history. I began producing my first leaves and vines. But all along through being in these archives, I felt something amiss in these stories from a queer past. I didn't completely trust the archives I was resourcing to tell the full story of Southern queer life at the intersections of race, non-binary gender, and class. I decided that the project must include voices and stories from the present alongside those from the past. And so I took the idea of story collection into queer communities. All stories are vital in the project's goal to invade dominant Southern narratives with queer histories that have been obscured for so long. So I often think about it as like a project that really engages the past and the present simultaneously, and really also I see the project as a way to build more intergenerational connections between queer communities and queer individuals. These are just quickly, I'm going to go through a lot of these rather quickly. These are examples of the kinds of stories that people are encouraged to think about sharing, describing your community, maybe what's your journey through gender. And some of the prompts ask people like tougher questions about what it's like to be out or to be closeted in the queer South. Some people feel like all they can commit is something about their identity or their name, their age, where they're from. And over time, the project has seen those kind of markers of identity as just as vital, just another way of contributing oneself, one's person to this growing mass of vines across the South. People often ask me like, what are the leaves? What exactly is it that people write on? And so we'll be looking at some of them in a minute, but this is just a little process behind the scenes for anyone who's interested. The leaves that are blank and the ones that also ask for stories from allies and supporters of LGBTQ people are printed with screen printing because there's a vast more majority of those. And then ones that have prompts on them are digitally printed. So these are some images of that. And so since 2015, that's when the project officially launched, I've been traveling across the southern states, collecting stories of LGBTQ people through community workshops and from these special archives, drawing on the preeminence of quilting in Southern folkways, and of course my own personal connection to the medium. All of the collected stories, scanned photographs, digitized archive documents, they're all quilted into kudzu leaves and vines. So these are some examples there of the workshops. We've done outdoor things. To date, the project has accumulated over 7,200 LGBTQ story leaves and is presented as installations of queer kudzu invading emblematic and or problematic monuments of the South. I often go to pride events across the South, so this is a little example of what that looks like. I have a little costume I wear. Done some incredible projects in LGBTQ senior community centers, as well as sort of other end of the spectrum, youth centers. These images are sort of taken from all over, but this one little bit right here are folks from Houston, Texas. Was there for a whole week and at a lot of different centers. And these are the leaves. Just a small selection of them there, and a nice detail of one. You kind of get a sense of how some people sit down and stitch and put more time into them. So as I said, this growing mass of vines I've been interested since the beginning in if to amass these queer Southern stories is a way of invading, leaning into the sort of the metaphor of an invasion of this non-native species, that I would want to invade problematic monuments of the South, such as Confederate statuary, flagpoles, Jim Crow era segregation architecture, state houses, churches, log cabins, mental asylums, and other structures that symbolize oppressive histories for queer people in the South. Former gay bars, nightclubs, and other queer landmarks that have become targets for removal are also called upon to be reclaimed by the queer vines. For each of the larger exhibitions, the monument being blanketed in kudzu is specific to the intersectional anti-oppression struggles in that region. Invasive Pulse Memorial honors the 49 victims of the 2016 Pulse nightclub massacre in Orlando, Florida. A quilted palm tree is created from bleached out domestic linens that are stitched into traditional Southern patchwork patterns with names that reference the events of that horrific night. Danger signals, bleeding heart, happy hunting grounds, bullseye, vortex. Creeping out through the tree is a withered vine of 49 kudzu leaves, dyed green until turned black, with each victim's name embroidered on them. They represent the queer Southern stories never shared in the Invasive Queer Kudzu Project, as the lives of these vibrant LGBTQIA souls were tragically cut short by an act of homophobic terrorism. It wasn't part of my bio, but I should just mention, I lived in Baltimore, Maryland for 6 years and have many intimate and ongoing relationships with the queer community there. This project was sort of designed over a 3-year process towards the end of my time there. The Invasive Queer Kudzu Baltimore exhibition featured a ghostly replica of Baltimore's Club Hippo, reclaimed by the Southern queer stories, mostly from Baltimore and from the ones gathered up to that point. Memorializing one of the country's oldest continuously operating gay dance clubs, which in 2015 became a CVS pharmacy. Opened in 1972 at the prominent Mount Vernon intersections of North Charles and Eager Streets, that's the neighborhood of Baltimore, the Club Hippo became an anchor of the emerging gay community. The club's motto was, "Where everyone is welcome," and the Hippo grew to be one of Baltimore's most inclusive spaces. This is a little gif of if you're interested how the vine comes about, where drag shows, leather competitions, karaoke, gay bingo, and themed events welcomed patrons of all stripes. As a monument in memoriam, Invasive Club Hippo celebrates the power of dance, of nightlife, and of connection that gay clubs have provided for queer communities for generations, and also points to the decline of such sites as the twin forces of gentrification and social media erode the necessity of queer-only space. And just a quick note there, in the back, again, I work pretty intimately with archives of a specific place on these projects, and these are all old event flyers from the 2 local gay papers in Baltimore. And they are from a range of dates, from 1972 to 2000, let's see, 5, I believe, from the Gay and Lesbian Center of Baltimore's archive. So these were reprinted and sort of put on a fake brick wall as like posters, as a little memorial also to the Club Hippo. There's some details. Now, Invasive Queer Kudzu Richmond is the more recent project from 2019, and it featured several monuments of the South, both historic and problematic, in the process of being invaded and reclaimed by queer Kudzu stories, most notably a 2-scale recreation of the central column of the Jefferson Davis monolith, currently holding sway, or now formerly holding sway, over Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. In the wake of Confederate monument removals and their aftermaths in New Orleans, Baltimore, and Charlottesville at this time, so in 2008, Richmond's newly elected mayor, LeVar Stoney, charged a commission of key stakeholders to determine the future of Richmond City's Confederate monuments. In 2018, the commission's detailed and nuanced proceedings, alone amongst the 4 statues considered for removal, the Jefferson Davis Memorial was unanimously suggested. That's the commission. It's a public document if you're interested at all in sort of understanding their proceedings. It was actually a rather nuanced process where when I say key stakeholders, that's literally people who have family ties to the Confederacy or to Jefferson Davis, who want to preserve the monument to, in many cases, African-American civil rights workers who've been fighting for their removal since the 50s. Amongst, let's see, however, restrictions in Virginia's state laws at the time governing the removal of war memorials ensured that the column would not be felled anytime soon. Invasive queer Kudzu Richmond, the invasion of the Richmond one aimed to expedite such removal. However, leaving the destroyed monument in situ to contemplate the legacy of problematic historical monuments and how destruction might be viewed as a critical stage in the life cycle of human history. Taking a cue from the Parisian communards' felling of the Vendôme column in Paris and its subsequent reconstruction, as well as Romantic era excursions to crumbling architectural antiquity sites, Invasive queer Kudzu Richmond aimed to expedite the removal and to also hold space for the sort of display, public interaction of a felled monument. And so this is our 2-scale 43-foot tall central column of the Jefferson Davis Monument. It's felled, it's a recreation of it. And just some side notes while we're looking through these, just to sort of a way to help you visually read the project is that in places where you see, I don't know if you can see my mouse in this situation, maybe you can. Places like this, these are the archive leaves. They sort of exist as these central units. They have to be kind of kept together because a lot of them are headed back to the archives from which they came. And the more organic leaf ones are the ones that community participants add to. And for this installation, because it was sited in Richmond and because there had been many community workshops over the years leading up to the installation, a lot of the stories that are there and able to be more visibly seen are the stories from Richmond. So they kind of have a bit of a center space holding in the project. The detail of some of those and of the monument. And a detail of one of the wall ones. I don't know if any of you, I imagine some of you or maybe all of you are very familiar with Monument Avenue in Richmond, but it is kind of stately boulevard. It's lined by maple trees, and the sort of general aesthetic we were going for, the central column had been felled and the kudzu climbs up the walls to also reference those maple trees, kudzu also taking over those. So activating this felled memorial, the project hosted a series of picnics amongst the vine-covered ruins on weekends during the run of the exhibition. This featured queer quilting bees, as well as lectures and demonstrations by various speakers, community organizers, and kudzu enthusiasts. We had kudzu basket weaving workshops, and we had daytime dance parties with local artists. Here we are making kudzu baskets. This was led by Julia Gartrell. She's right there in the center. And in closing, this lecture would be remiss without celebrating the actual demolition and removal of the Jefferson Davis Monument, which occurred this past summer in July 2020, after months of the Black Lives Matter protest in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. So I just sort of end here with this image that is our recreation of the Vindicatrix statue that crowned the top of that memorial. And there she is also being towed away. And so with that, I'll close, and I welcome your questions and conversation. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. So many rich layers to this project, and the various iterations when it's been presented, I think, open up for some really fruitful discussion. For those of you in attendance, if you have questions that you want to add into the Q&A or the chat area, we'll wait a minute to see what comes in. I have a couple, and I imagine my colleagues here might as well. We have a comment. Very interesting and enthralling project. I look forward to seeing how it will unfold as time goes by. That raises one question. Do you see this project continuing? I mean, this opportunity to kind of look at the events of 2021, did you think that we would see this moment? And two, are there ways in which you see the project carrying forward?
Yeah, it's of course such a big question, and such an important one. To answer your question, Naomi, I didn't imagine in my lifetime that many of these monuments would come down. I should most speak to the situation in Virginia because I'm very familiar with the activist circles there and the histories there. Even in Virginia, with the way it has been changing politically in recent years, or at least recent election cycles, it remains a rather conservative place. I didn't imagine that the legislature would ever change in makeup enough to change the War Memorials Act, and I didn't think these would be coming down. It's actually, interestingly, in the lead up, like while the project was happening at 1708 Gallery in Richmond in 2019, there had been a year-long project at the Valentine Museum, which is the history museum of the city of Richmond. Really phenomenal, small, formerly house museum, but they've expanded. They have such a rich collection. But the director had hosted and invited, there was like a design competition for how to redesign Monument Avenue. And it was international. People sent in proposals from all over the world. And it was just such an interesting exercise to see how people would deal with problematic monuments, how they might keep them there, but redesign signage, how like through activations and public performances, things can be recontextualized, reconsidered. How if you're going to keep the monuments, then you should supplement with monuments to other people who make up said place, and document other and monumentalize, if you will, other histories that have been forgotten. So it was, when we did that project, and the project has kind of an odd afterlife that never quite happened either, which was that there was a organization I won't name, but based in Georgia, that was interested in, we were in conversation, again, all this was changed by the pandemic, but wanted the project remains in storage, the elements of the monument, because another organization wanted to ceremoniously burn them afterwards. And I was interested in that because I never intended to keep the monument parts of the project. And yeah, so I don't know. It exists in an interesting way. I don't even know that it will be re-exhibited in some context. I think, decisions and public dialogues have been underway and have happened, and the decision was to remove it. My suggestion was to destroy it and leave it in place. And that's one of many ideas for how we might deal with and sort of render new these monuments. A second part of that question is hard to answer because I just don't know the fate of the project. As I'm sure many of you can imagine, it was everything about the pandemic, of course, shut down any opportunities for social engagement or a socially engaged public art project. The project has always had very small tentacles of people learning about it either organically from websites and online activities, or hearing me talk, and people have sent in leaves. So I received leaves through the mail, just in little smatterings every now and then, and those get added to the project. And I moved to Canada for a new job and for my relationship. So I'm in a new cultural context, and in some ways, that in combination with the pandemic, the project lies dormant right now. I think it will always have opportunities to be installed, and I'm always very interested if I've been invited to either realize a new project, we'll sort of undertake the same kind of work of like sort of working with local archives, working with local queer communities, and sort of adding to the vine. And another way that the project does or will continue to live in different iterations is that it was, as I mentioned in the talk, it began as a way of thinking about better connecting current present day, especially younger queer audiences, with their queer forebearers in the South. So the project has always had a bit of an archival lean to it. And I'm grateful that a number of the archives that I've worked with are interested in receiving the vine in different portions when at a sort of indefinite time, whenever I decide that it's maybe time for them to head back to archives. So I'm grateful for that it will kind of continue to feed future generations through archives. Since I have so many historians in the mix, I imagine it's important to note that it's a very different. The project is realized as a kind of touchable archive. People actually, when they visit the project, are invited to pick up a leaf and turn it over, because people often write stories on one side and their name and identity on the other. We have a lot of situations like that. So audience members are invited to not like drag things up, but to just sort of carefully turn over leaves. So yes, I'll sort of cede to other questions, but it's a big question mark. I think how do we move forward with socially engaged work in a post-pandemic world? Because I think we all understand we'll be sort of recovering and recouping. It won't be life back to normal right away for another couple years with these kinds of social events. Queer populations are vulnerable like other minoritarian populations, and wary of the vaccine like other minoritarian populations. And so even to kind of do these sort of social practice works with queer community and, at events like Pride, I think many of us are waiting to see how those kinds of events will unfold. Yeah.
Just one addition to the comment that came in. It came in from Mary from Occupied Mexico, Gulf of Mexico bioregion, Houston, Texas. She added that to her comment. Said, thank you for doing this work.
Awesome. Thank you for attending. I had a fabulous time in Houston. I'm actually going to be talking about the Houston connections to the project in a couple weeks with the Houston Museum of Art. If you're interested, I don't have any event details to get for you right now, but do go to their website and look around with my name.
Other questions? We'll put them in the chat or the Q&A, or maybe my colleagues have questions from your own research areas.
Aaron,
Hi, Ben.
am I here? I don't really have a question so much. I thought it was a really interesting talk, and that when you got to the Confederate monuments, and I'm fascinated by your approach to that. I'm aware of the African American community's discomfort with those monuments, but I hadn't really thought of it from the perspective of the LGBTQ community. But whenever this whole monument business and them coming down, I'm always reminded of one of my most famous, or a favorite, not my most famous, but my favorite poem by Percy Shelley about Ozymandias. That's about the trunkless statue out in the middle of the sandy wilderness of the mighty Ozymandias, who warned everyone to, fear his works and despair. And I think monuments, not every monument, but certainly the monuments of the Confederacy are in many ways just a human expression of vanity, that over time a different generation comes along, reinterprets that past. And whereas in the Ozymandias poem, it's the sands of time, here we've got both the kudzu kind of overrunning it and defacing it and reshaping it, but then also a community of a whole new generation reevaluating what's important to them, and perfectly valid way of, you can decorate the art, destroy the art.
Yeah.
Even in its own destruction, it becomes a new kind of art. So you're really not destroying anything any more so than, the Ozymandias pedestal is still there, and it says something, not what the original leader or Ozymandias thought it was going to say over time, but it still has a powerful message.
Yeah.
Just a thought, just something that I was thinking about.
I don't know this specific Ozzy. Maybe
it's a very short poem. It's really it's a Percy Shelley one, and it's just a trunkless statue of a once a mighty king named Ozymandias, who I guess in a different age ruled this land. And there's this giant, presumably at one point a giant statue where he's proclaiming to the world that they must, fear him and despair, and yet it's now just a long forgotten trunkless statue that a passerby looks at with curiosity and is like, huh, Ozymandias, wow, whatever.
This is sort of sidebar note. You might be interested in Druid Hill Park in Baltimore. I don't know if any of you've ever been there, but it's one of Baltimore's like big grand parks. From sort of the age of parks, like early 20th century, even a little older than that actually. They have a famous greenhouse there, actually, believe it or not. I think it's one of the oldest greenhouses of its size in the U.S. But anyways, in Druid Hill Park, it's actually a rather large park. I don't know if it was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, but it's in the vein of the sort of like Central Park and sort of the
Right.
what do they refer to that, the heart of the lungs of a city, kind of. And there are just some sort of more wild spaces as a way to describe them. They're not really maintained. They're just like meadowy kind of parts of the park. And there are some very randomly placed, I don't know to who they are, but they're like very neglected and in many ways defaced and deformed statues in that part of the park. I don't know who, a lot of them are German names. They're famous German communities and Polish communities and
Right.
Irish and Italian communities in Baltimore. It's very much a city of immigrants. But anyways, it's you might be interested in that. There's at least a couple of like torsos with no heads. Towards your metaphor.
That fits right in. Humans like to have some sense of immortality, but a monument is an attempt to do that. But
yeah, I mean, I'm interested in like archives as monuments and like public gatherings as monuments. In a way, I mean, I dropped like a pretty deep well of scrutiny against almost all monuments. I follow pretty closely the call for new monuments that seems to be most rapidly happening in New York City. I feel like the last time I read, it's like something the current mayor wants to have it's like around 400 new monuments completed before his term ends, or at least the process has started underway. And because they've been kind of rushing through these processes that that normally involve a lot of like a long period of public input, and the competition is sort of nationally or locally broadcast, they've run into a number of different obstacles and a lot of community pushback around who is represented, why, whose visage should be represented. I think that's an interesting thing that continues to be ongoing in dialogues around, in particular, racialized people of the United States and elsewhere, that rather than abstract or things that maybe just have names that don't present visages of people, that the visages actually are the reason for the monument, and those are the reasons to have them. Which is, interesting. I would in many ways counter like, oh, I sort of welcome all the different approaches we monumentalize people through so many different ways, rather than creating sculptures, statuaries of their visages. So yeah, we live in, anyone studying monuments, my God, it's such a rich time to be doing that kind of work. And you're right, we are very much have sort of turned over. We're in quite a big period of turning over our considerations publicly and culturally around monuments.
And at the risk of some cynical dark humor, let's go ahead and build those 400 monuments so that people have something to tear down 300 years from now.
Exactly right. The second it's the last stone is laid, it's perhaps problematic to a new and a different generation. So yeah, and there I could have made it a part of this talk, but I did a lot of history locally about this particular monument. It has its own very complicated history. It was barely even made. It's a rather, in multiple ways, it's very contentious. And the reason it was unanimously chosen to be removed is that because it actually, the people who were interested in the preservation aspect and family ties, things along that line, those people are called like, they are the first sons of Virginia. They don't claim Jefferson Davis because he was not from Virginia. No. So they don't actually care about him in terms of Virginia history. Then you have people who are sort of this other camp that are just like Virginia, just Virginia. Like this is about a moment in Virginia's history. And they are not interested in him for a sort of similar reason. There are people who are a little bit more of the like, just pure Civil War reenactment camp, increasingly white nationalist camp, also aren't interested because he was a failed leader. He didn't win the war, so they.
Neither did Lee, but
so, so it isn't, like they he doesn't hold and if I can't, this image, I could have done a better job with that per se. It was in that earlier one, but he is actually rather small in the monument, his statue of him. And if you, in the image that's on the screen right now, the construction worker with the orange shirt is actually his head, right where his head is about where the statue would have been. But the Davis monument has been removed. The Vindicatrix, which was typical of Confederate statuary, but also numerous early classical like celebrations of America's triumph over the British, things like that. Vindicatrix is an old symbol of Greco-Roman times. It's just a symbol of victory. Well, victory is not the Vindicatrix. Victory is victorious or Victoria, and the Vindicatrix is related to our word vindictive. She's the sort of the goddess in defeat. But the choice that they made to have her hand in the certain way that it is was a particular to the Confederacy as a sort of defeat, not defeat kind of thing.
Lost cause.
Yeah. So anyways, there's many histories just in the monument alone.
Yeah, it was a fascinating, very thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.
We're past the hour here, so I'd love to, unless Professor Kim, do you have any questions that you'd like to toss in? I've got one that I can add. This is just a practical question, since you talked so eloquently about the foodways of kudzu and the kind of craft practices associated with kudzu. So as a kind of closing question, have you ever tried to grow your own kudzu?
I haven't, because I've never needed to grow it. It's just in such abundance in around Kingston, Tennessee, where my family's from. And in Richmond, it actually grew in quite abundance, like very close to a part of the James River where there was a trail. There's like a running little hiking trail along the river. I never got to it. It's something I hope to do at some point. I have a couple of folks in my life I would love to do this with, but actually host people do a lot of like foraging, culinary kind of tours now. I'd really love to do and have wanted since the beginning of the project to do a kind of lead people out in the field and like harvest kudzu and make jelly together as an event. The picnic series, it happened every Saturday for the 6-week run of the exhibition, and we always served biscuits from a local bakery and kudzu jelly for the people who came. So, and actually I had sweet kudzu jelly and I had hot pepper kudzu jelly, and the hot pepper one actually came from Alabama. I don't recall where. It's something, it was like a website I found called like Alabama Foodways, something along those lines. So yeah, a number of little connections to Alabama. Okay, well, I'll stop sharing. Thank you all for having me.
This has been just such a pleasure. Really, truly, thank you for sharing your work with us, and such a great project and discussion.
Yeah, and a great climax to the whole conference. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you.